Welcome. It is great to see so many of you here for this Professor Benjamin Poore's inaugural lecture. And a special welcome to those of you who have travelled for this exciting occasion and to those joining us via the live stream. It is great to have you all, come join us. It is great to have all of you as part of this event. So my name is Dr. Rebecca Benzie, and I am a lecturer in theatre here in the School of Arts and Creative Technologies. And I have collaborated with Ben across multiple projects here at the University of York. Now, before we begin, I have a little bit of housekeeping to do. So I've been asked to tell those of you in the auditorium that if you hear a fire alarm, this is not a drill. So please follow the student ambassadors. These are the fantastic folks in the purple t-shirts. And they will escort us to the nearest fire exit. I'm going to give us a quick overview of today's event. So in a moment, I will introduce Professor Poore. Then Ben's going to speak to us for around 20 minutes. And the themes of his lecture will then be developed in a discussion between Ben and Professor Dan Rebellato, who joins us today from Royal Holloway, University of London. Following this, we then invite you to stay for a drinks reception, which will be taking place in the foyer, and we look forward to continuing the conversation there. So let's make a start, and it is my privilege to give an introduction to Professor Benjamin Poore today. Ben took his undergraduate degree in English Language and Literature at Worcester College, Oxford, and trained as a secondary school teacher in English and drama. After 10 years in the teaching profession, he returned to university in 2004 to take an MA in drama and theatre at Royal Holloway, University of London, specialising in playwriting. He stayed at Royal Holloway to gain his PhD and took up a post as lecturer in theatre at York in 2008. Ben has developed an extensive body of publications during his time at York, and his books include Heritage, Nostalgia and Modern British Theatre, Staging the Victorians, Theatre and Empire, and Sherlock Holmes from Screen to Stage. He also edited the collection Neo-Victorian Villains for the Brill Neo-Victorian series and co-edited a special issue of the Journal of Neo-Victorian Studies with Beth Palmer on performing the Neo-Victorian. He has published articles and book chapters on, among other things, the TV show Penny Dreadful and the cultural afterlives and adaptations of Count Dracula, Jekyll and Hyde, Queen Victoria, Joseph Merrick, Sweeney Todd, and works by Charles Dickens and Charlotte Bronte. Since 2012, Ben has been part of the Deaf and Culture Network, which has developed walks, a reading group, a book series, symposia, and 4 international deaf and culture conferences. Ben's also been a PI on a number of funded projects, including most recently 2 initiatives to develop his public-facing activities with Barley Hall in York. The 2019 pilot project, Staging History at York Theatre Royal, led to a collaboration between Ben, myself, and playwright Dr. Poppy Corbett. Poppy was commissioned to write a play telling the story of the ground which York Theatre Royal stands, using material from the theatre's archive. Poppy's play, The Shoe That Flew, was produced as a piece of Zoom theatre for York Festival Ideas in 2021, with actors from our undergraduate theatre programme. In the depths of the pandemic, this project was a great opportunity for students to engage with new forms of online performance alongside exploration of archival material. Ben's practice at York has also included running a history play project for novice playwrights titled Chronicity. This was undertaken with the expert support of playwright Dr. Bridget Foreman and drew on the layers of history at specific sites in York as stimulus for new writing. In 2021, Ben was part of running an online conference with Professor Dan Rebellato, Professor Lynette Goddard, Chris Megson, Dr. Chris Megson, forgive me, and at Royal Holloway, and Dr. Nick Holden at the University of Greenwich. The conference was titled Resisting Theatre and focused on analysing plays with attention to methodologies and performance practice. In addition, Ben has run 2 pedagogical research projects funded by York Strategic Learning and Teaching Grants. These use a dialogic pedagogy approach to reimagine university teaching. In the first of these, Professor Jan Hardman collaborated with Ben and Dr. Catherine Lovesmith on developing a dialogic pedagogy practice in seminars. In the second, myself and Ben had the opportunity to work with the dramaturg Selma Dimitrovic on devising collaborative and interactive lectures. Ben's collaborative work on dialogic pedagogy has been instrumental to the field in both exploring his approach in a higher education context and equipping students with the tools to cultivate collaborative co-thinking in their approach to learning. And very excitingly, Ben's new book, this feels like a good water break moment, titled The Contemporary History Play, Staging English and American Past, is due out next year as part of the Methuen Drama Engage series. This new book includes exploration of some case studies Ben will touch on today and speaks to the wider cultural picture of the uses of history in contemporary playwriting, taking stock of this particular cultural moment. On a personal note, I've had the joy of working with Ben across multiple projects, and I'm thankful for his collegiality and his mentorship. I first encountered Ben's work when I was a PhD researcher through his monograph, Heritage, Nostalgia and Modern British Theatre, along with his work on neo-Victorianism. These publications influenced and challenged the way I thought and think about representations of the past on stage. After meeting at the International Federation of Theatre Research, I went on to be a postdoctoral researcher and later research fellow across projects with Ben at York Theatre Royal, Barley Hall, and in collaboration on dialogic pedagogy. Now, I use the word joy intentionally when I refer to working with Ben. My experience on these projects has been one of bouncy co-thinking and genuine excitement and enthusiasm for the subject matter and for the potential of what could be found out through the research. One thing I admire about Ben's approach to research is his notion of always building a bigger table. He gives thought and attention to who else can be invited into the conversation, how areas of crossover can be celebrated, and how different expertise can be learnt from. And in this, he considers how to foster an environment of equity and equality. Hence, dialogue appears to be at the centre of how Ben works, along with attention to thought on dramaturgy and curation. With that in mind, I think it is a testament to this focus on dialogue that it has influenced the shape of this evening's event. So, without further ado, it gives me a great joy to introduce Professor Benjamin Poore for his inaugural lecture, The Politics of Playwriting with History.
Thanks, Rebecca, for such a warm and generous introduction. Very much appreciated. Hello, good evening, everyone. I'm going to reflect for a few minutes now about my work as a scholar, what it's meant to me, and what I see as my purpose as a professor of theatre. I'm then going to introduce you to 4 snapshots from historical drama that will serve as examples to lead us into the discussion section of tonight's event. So, here goes. Picture me as an impressionable child in the early 1980s. We take a family holiday to Battle in Sussex, and I learn all about the Battle of Hastings. I purchase a souvenir scroll on parchment. The royal wedding of Prince Charles and Lady Diana Spencer is all that's on television and in the newspapers. Union Jack bunting is everywhere. Incongruously, I become mildly obsessed with the television series Brideshead Revisited, with its atmosphere of nostalgic melancholy, alcoholism, and queer romantic longing. Yes, I came of political age in the decade dominated by Margaret Thatcher's Conservative Party. The first big news story when I was at university was Thatcher's resignation. I rarely went to the theatre as a teenager, but I understood through television, radio, and newspapers that there was a growing cultural bias towards the past. Even as a youth, I lived vicariously in a succession of mythical and consumable versions of history. 1066, Prince Charming and his shy Di, the Roaring Twenties, and the English country house. Decades later, when I was applying to study for a PhD at Royal Holloway, something about that era and Mrs. Thatcher's declared commitment to Victorian values had stayed with me. Thatcher had praised the values of thrift, restraint, hard work, self-help, but at the same time, she was decimating the country's industrial base, selling public assets, and deregulating the city. Investigating this contradiction led me back to the 1960s, to a point at which I felt the tension between modernization and nostalgia seemed to be at its most acute. So, on the one hand, slum clearances and brutalist high-rises. On the other, pith helmets, feather boas, and military jackets bought from fashionable boutiques with names like "I was Lord Kitchener's valet." I decided that my PhD project would be a kind of cultural history of the Victorians since the 1960s, using theatre as the central art form around which the narrative was focused. Since then, I've remained fascinated by the ways that theatre uses history. Having spent several years focusing on the stage representation of the Victorians, about 5 years ago, it occurred to me that we could learn more about how theatre uses history by looking at plays about any period rather than about only one. How would we know that any trope or technique was a distinctive way of staging the Victorians unless we knew that plays about other eras weren't doing that as well? The more I thought about it, in fact, the more the history play seemed to be a major under-analysed form of the 21st century. One of the first scholars to write about historical drama as a genre was Herbert Lindenberger. And back in 1975, he wrote that for nearly all canonical playwrights, from Christopher Marlowe to Bertolt Brecht, quote, "Every major dramatist was also a writer of history plays," unquote. Thinking about the plays that are most often set and taught in schools and colleges, there's a heavy emphasis on plays with historical settings, which seem to lend their action an increased gravitas or resonance. So we might think of Amadeus, A Man for All Seasons, The History Boys, The Madness of King George, Translations, Our Country's Good, An Inspector Calls, Hobson's Choice, The Crucible, Moon on a Rainbow Shawl even, The Empress, which has just been included in the GCSE syllabus by Tanika Gupta. Each of these is a historical play, as well as a play that was new at the time. Yet the play's uses of history were not, as far as I could see, being analysed collectively as a set of approaches or strategies. So that's how I began my current research on the contemporary history play. And by a contemporary history play, I mean a piece of new writing for the stage that has a historical setting or multiple historical settings. The descriptor contemporary means that it's a play written in our present age, so not a Shakespeare history play, for example, but it also acknowledges that every imagined version of the past is inescapably intertwined with the present in which it's written. All history plays reflect the contemporary moment. Researching the contemporary history play is quite a risky endeavour, and I understand why not many people want to do it. There are so many things that you can be wrong about, so many things you can be ignorant about, both from theatrical history and from the pasts being represented. You can be ignorant on all fronts. What drives me in this, then, despite these challenges, is a combination of motives. Sure, part of me is drawn to those lost and imaginary worlds that opened up to me as an early 80s kid. I was a latecomer to theatre going. I didn't start attending regularly until my early 30s. And so part of my motivation is to understand how history plays intersect with film and television costume drama and historical fiction. I want to know and share what's different about history when it's performed in a theatre, why people go when there's so much history that can be consumed from home. I've also become fascinated by the history of playwriting itself, how writers navigate a tradition and innovate in relation to it. So the history of historical playwriting has a pleasingly circular quality to it. Always, I'm thinking about the convergence between the historical time that the play represents, the time in which it's written, and the time in which it's performed. And I want to identify correspondences and connections between plays that go beyond the links of theme, subject matter, chronology, to propose new relationships and new playwriting histories. With a knowledge of the history of playwriting comes an awareness of the circumstances under which plays and writers become canonized, or else become neglected, or forgotten, or fall out of favour. I see part of my role as championing powerful plays and productions, particularly where they go against the grain of what's considered a well-made or well-written history play, and using talks and publications to get innovative and brilliant work recognised and remembered. The book I've just written, that Rebecca referred to, that's out next year, reflects where I am now. In each chapter, I look at a different method of organising history in dramatic form, highlighting how the plays of the last 10 years often seem to use a combination of these different forms that were singularly used in previous ages. I'm especially interested in history plays that look outward, that follow global migration journeys, rather than digging deep only into the mythical soil of England. Hence, the book is called The Contemporary History Play, Staging English and American Pasts, because plays originating in the United States have, I believe, had a discernible influence on historical playwriting in the UK, particularly with regard to form and theatricality. And since it seems our culture wars are now being consciously imported from America, their contemporary history plays also have a lot to say to us. So, where next? In the future, I want to be more outward focused still. What can we learn about the history play if we decenter Anglophone theatre or place it in dialogue with other countries' theatrical representations of the same events? At the same time, I still have the ambition, which I know I share with Rebecca, to take this understanding of historical drama and see how it works in the rehearsal room, how history plays actually get made, and to see if there can be a mutually beneficial relationship between theatre and practice. So, here are 4 snapshots from the history of historical drama to lead us into the discussion. The first takes us back to 1968. And I've just done the thing that I thought I wasn't going to do, which is to go right back to the start. There we are. Okay. Snapshot number 1. 1968. It's a play that kick-started my PhD research. Early Morning by Edward Bond was a deliberate provocation to the censor of plays at the time, the Lord Chamberlain. The Lord Chamberlain was officially a member of the Queen's household, and no play could be granted a license for public performance without his approval or without the changes that he had demanded. The Royal Court Theatre, its artistic director, William Gaskell, and the playwright, Edward Bond, had been fighting a running battle with the Lord Chamberlain since Saved was first produced at the theatre 3 years earlier. By exposing the ridiculousness and outdatedness of the state licensing of theatre, the Royal Court hoped to bring the whole edifice of censorship crashing down. What caught my attention with Early Morning was the way that it had used history to provoke the Lord Chamberlain, conjuring up a surreal, satirical fantasy in which Queen Victoria is a cannibal who kills her husband and assaults Florence Nightingale. The play hit as many taboos in one go as it could. The Lord Chamberlain had strict rules against the depiction of royalty, so who better to attack than Queen Victoria herself, the founder of the myth of the royal family? There were strictures against the portrayal of public figures, so fine, let's have erstwhile Prime Ministers Gladstone and Disraeli sharing a bed. Let's have Florence Nightingale having sex with dying wounded soldiers. Authority was not to be mocked, so let's refer to a film called Policeman in Black Nylons, which served as a reminder that the licensing system for cinema was much more permissive than that for theatre. Even the Lord Chamberlain featured as a character in Early Morning. Cast Marianne Faithfull, an icon of the 1960s counterculture, and in censor-baiting terms, you have a royal flush. The play was advertised as a private club performance to get around the public licensing laws. It was shut down under threat of prosecution, but when the Lord Chamberlain's powers of censorship were ended by the Theatres Act of 1968, 55 years ago this month, the Royal Court immediately announced a season of Bond's plays to include Early Morning and Saved. Snapshot 2, and we're fast-forwarding to 1980. The Brideshead and Battle of Hastings loving child that was me had no inkling that a few months earlier, a play about a different historical invasion had been making the headlines in the broadsheets and in the tabloids. The Romans in Britain, a play by Howard Brenton, is remembered today mostly because it was the subject of 2 obscenity trials brought about by Mary Whitehouse of the National Viewers and Listeners Association. This may be a familiar face to some of you. I'll return in a moment to Whitehouse. The play is set across 3 periods of historical time: 54 BC, when Julius Caesar invades Britain, 515 AD, when the Saxons invade, and 1980, focusing on the troubles in Northern Ireland. The Roman legionnaires were costumed in the modern uniforms of the British military, making the historical parallel impossible to ignore. Like Early Morning, the Romans in Britain was powerfully anti-nostalgic. But unlike Early Morning, it was also overtly schematic in its use of the past. Brenton wrote in the play's introduction that he had to go to elaborate historical lengths, quote, to convince an audience of the truth of my arguments, unquote. So the Mary Whitehouse prosecution was brought because there is a simulated act of sexual assault by a Roman on a Celt in the invasion scene. Whitehouse didn't see the play herself, but sent her solicitor to watch it on her behalf. First, she tried to prosecute the theatre, then brought a personal prosecution against the play's director, Michael Bogdanov. The second trial collapsed after 3 days. What the attempt at prosecution of the Romans in Britain demonstrated, for me, was that the forces of cultural reaction had not been defeated by the liberalisation of the 1960s, merely displaced. Premiering a year or so into Margaret Thatcher's first term as Prime Minister, the reception of the Romans in Britain provided a preview of the kind of history and the kind of culture that the new conservatism would not support. Whitehouse and Thatcher maintained a cordial correspondence and met on several occasions. Snapshot 3, and we're into the 21st century. Rockets and Blue Lights by Winsome Pinnock opens at the Royal Exchange in Manchester in March 2020. Fateful timing. It closes after press night. It's restaged in a co-production with the National Theatre in London after the national lockdowns and after the murder of George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter protests, and the outpouring of good intentions declarations by UK institutions. In the play, we have a historical drama featuring the painter J.M.W. Turner and a Black London family in 1840. And this runs alongside a more recent historical drama set in 2007 about an actor, Lou. She is making a historical film drama about the Zong massacre, in which Turner increasingly takes centre stage at the expense of the African character that Lou plays. But we're also seeing scenes from the film which intersect with the 2 historical timelines of the play's main or outer narrative. It's complex, it's multi-layered, and it's uncompromising in its depiction of the legacies of slavery and its exposure of white saviorism and the positioning of white innocence. Turner and the actor who plays Turner in the 21st century, Roy, are shown as correspondingly complicit in racial injustice. Finally, Snapshot 4 takes us to 2022, last year, when Jackie Sibley's Drury's play, Mary's Seacole, is produced at the Donmar Theatre in London, having been previously staged in New York in 2019. The play begins as if it will feature Mary Seacole telling her story through direct address in the language and tone of her autobiography, Wonderful Adventures of Mrs. Seacole in Many Lands, published in 1857. But from the moment that another character, Duppy, walks over to Mary Seacole and fits her with a Bluetooth earpiece, the audience is given due notice that this is not a conventional biographical drama. We are soon in a modern nursing home. The cast multi-role as characters from different periods, all with variations on Mary's name: Mamie, Miriam, Duppy Mary, May, and Mary. We move from the nursing home to Seacole's Hotel in Kingston, Jamaica, where she cared for English cholera sufferers in the 1850s, and then to a city park where two nannies are watching their charges, and then to a nursing school where a nurse is being trained in how to handle a mass shooting incident, and eventually to the Crimea, with Mary Seacole alongside and in direct competition with Florence Nightingale. There, we're presented with a mashup of the lines and situations that we've already experienced, building in intensity, adding new perspectives and horrors. In the Donmar production, a cascade of body parts tumbled onto the stage at this point. Mary's Seacole seems to present a different play with different rules in every scene, whilst being unarguably a unified work of art. Mary's Seacole focuses on what its biographical subject means rather than what she did. It's about the tension between how a woman of colour sought to represent herself and how others might then insist and persist in trying to represent her. This Mary Seacole specifies that, quote, "I am, not to be prideful, the most impressive woman you have ever encountered," unquote. And she adds, "I give power to myself." For me, Mary's Seacole and Rockets and Blue Lights represent two of the most innovative and powerful treatments of historical material on stage in recent years. Not coincidentally, I think, they're the work of women of colour who are able to recognise the multiple nuanced ways, the power dynamics where people's treatment of each other can shift and change according to racialised and gendered assumptions. They're staging under-acknowledged histories that take us outside the comfort zone of what's often known as the Henrys and Hitler. Looking back, we might see certain correspondences between Sibley's Drury's playful, bleak, and uncompromising vision of multiple Mary Seacoles, then and now, and Edward Bond's carnal, carnivorous take on history in Early Morning. And we might see some connections between the kind of historical juxtapositions that Brenton makes in The Romans in Britain and the multiple timelines of Rockets and Blue Lights, which connect then and now, professional and domestic, factual and filmic, real and supernatural. Both Rockets and Blue Lights and Mary Seacole are major plays and deeply challenging to the status quo, but neither faced prosecution or cause to be banned. Has the selective outrage machine of the media and its friends in government missed these two theatrical events by accident? Or is there something about these plays and their theatrical complexity that makes them fly under the radar of culture wars controversy in the ways that Early Morning and The Romans in Britain did not? So, to help me discuss these questions, I'm delighted to move over to the discussion part of the event and to introduce Dan Rebellato. Dan is Professor of Contemporary Theatre at Royal Holloway, University of London. He's published widely on British theatre, the musical, naturalist theatre, and playwriting. He is also a playwright whose work has been published, produced, and revived internationally, and is regularly broadcast on BBC Radio. His most recent play, Slow Air, was broadcast on Monday of this week and still available on BBC Sounds. Dan was also my PhD supervisor. So please welcome Dan to the stage.
And thank you, Ben, for a typically witty, wide-ranging and thoughtful presentation. So we now move into the chat show part of this evening.
That's it.
There were so many things that came up in that presentation. I think one of the things that immediately I feel like I want to pick up is you remind us that the act of thinking about history is itself historical, that we think about history in different ways in different historical moments. And I sort of wondered whether it'd be worth thinking a bit, perhaps bracketing theatre for a moment, just about whether you think there are ways of generalising, obviously, but thinking about the 1960s, where your first kind of case study is from, the 1980s, and the present decade. Is it possible to see distinct ways in which the culture starts to figure history?
Yeah, I think there are vast differences. I mean, there's a recent book by Hannah Rose Woods called Raw Nostalgia, A Backwards History of Britain, that looks at the relationship between nostalgia and the British. And there's a lot in there about this criticism of rewriting history that is often raised today when controversial information and knowledge about history is brought into the public forum. And of course, that's historians' job to rewrite history. And therefore, there's an implicit suspicion of historical activity of historians themselves embedded in that. And so that creates an atmosphere, I think, of suspicion. Hannah Rose Woods also points out that in contemporary culture, empire is everywhere and nowhere. It's considered to be the thing that isn't really mentioned, and somehow the Second World War is an expiation for empire, is felt to be the thing that proved historically the British were the good guys. And so there is a covering up. I think Paul Gilroy said this many years ago, a covering up of the imperial legacy by the legacy of the Second World War, which is why it's clung to so fiercely by a certain demographic.
That's very interesting. It's also, I mean, it's a key part of David Olusoga's book, Black and British, that he talks about the asymmetry that we talk a lot in schools and so on about the abolition of slavery, but very little about slavery. So we like the good bit where we behaved well, but it's slightly less, it's a bit more hazy in the sort of popular cultural memory. I wonder whether, one of the things, of course, that seems to characterize the contemporary moment is that sort of hyper-polarization, whereby history just becomes this sort of political football. I think the way the New York Times, do you remember the New York Times set up the 1619 Project, which was an attempt to systematically think about American history from a kind of African-American perspective, which of course infuriated the populist right, and Donald Trump set up the 1776 Commission to create patriotic history. And it just seems a bit like, we're just sort of, well, I have my history over here and you have your history over there. Is that how you see where we are at the moment?
Yes, a kind of separate spheres thing. So there's a great book by Alison Dagnes called Super Mad at Everything All the Time, which is an attempt to kind of historicize in America, particularly how over 50 years there's been this gradual separation of news spheres. And she has some great terms to describe what goes on there. Epistemic closure is the term that's used to kind of describe where you're not getting information from anything outside of one bubble, and you become prey to all kinds of fantastical thinking as a result. And the other one that's really stuck with me is negative partisanship, which is the idea of voting for policies, not because they're necessarily in your interests, but because they will punish your enemies. So that leads to this idea of separate histories. And conspiratorial thinking itself is kind of grounded in a twisted approach to the historical method, I suppose.
That's very interesting, and I think that also takes us to the theatre in a way, because one of the things that I think comes out of your project is the sense that thinking about history is a sort of way in which we sort of come together to look outward at who we think we are. And of course, in a way, theatre's a bit like that. You know, in the theatre, we come together to think a bit about who we are. So I wonder if there is a sort of, in the kind of tidal shifts of how we think about history, is there any connection with the way we think about theatre? Because it seems to me that the cultural state of theatre in the 60s and the 80s and the present era are again quite distinct. Do you have a sort of, do you have a picture in your head about how theatre figured culturally in those moments?
I think in the 1960s, theatre was very much part of that moment of trying to make things new and bright and modern and airy. And so, you know, part of the thinking behind the Royal Court's campaign was to do away with the 1843 Theatres Act and all of those Victorian strictures. So an early title, I think, for early morning was Recent Morning Died Queen Victoria, which really puts on the line the idea that we are only just emerging from the Victorian period. Thinking of another play that was staged a year later, Peter Barnes' The Ruling Class, which features a kind of House of Lords of cobwebbed skeletons. So that idea of breaking away from the past was very strongly embedded in that thinking. But what strikes me as well about the theatre culture of the time is reading about early morning, just how few outlets there were, how concentrated it was. You could have a single kind of club night performance and all the press would be there. It would be written up and reported in all the outlets. And I suppose I've also been thinking recently about how that then leads to a kind of canonizing process in which a certain type of public figure, playwright, often difficult white men, are highlighted as being the kind of voice of a generation by this very kind of restricted media culture of the time. And just thinking about the 1980s, what feels different there is with the Romans in Britain, yes, it could, you know, we can talk about the individual kind of circumstances in which Whitehouse brought the prosecution, but more broadly, we might say that it's part of a cultural reaction against the speed at which this new wave of playwrights and play and theatrical activity had been assimilated into the major institutions of the National Theatre and the RSC. This idea of dirty plays kind of getting a major staging rather than work from the classical repertory. So I think that there was a kind of cultural tipping point there as well, where that access to the major institutions was being pushed back against.
That's interesting as well, because I mean, comparing the 60s and 80s, I mean, again, working generalisations, British theatre has tended to alternate 20-year periods where the theatre is expanding and getting more money and getting bigger audiences and new venues. So the 50s and 60s, it's kind of expanding. 70s and 80s, it contracts. 90s with the lottery and thousands with, you know, the Boyden Report and new funding, it's expanding again. And the 2010s and 2020s, obviously because of austerity and COVID and those sorts of things, we've seen a retraction again. Maybe this is wishful thinking, because it means that the next decade's going to be really good, everyone. But you know, so there's a big difference, isn't there, between early morning being at a moment of theatre's absolute confidence that it's right at the heart and centre of what's doing, and it's embodying the politics of the moment. Whereas the Romans in Britain, you know, it's 1980, we already know that Thatcher's in, she's going to change a lot of things. They're already talking about Arts Council cuts. It's already in a hostile kind of environment. What about now? Because you said that interesting thing about the fact that nobody has kicked up a fuss about these plays that you've talked about. What's going on now?
Yeah, I'm wondering why that is, because it seems like every theatre adjacent and history adjacent area of the culture seems to get decried by government and its media allies at various points, but not theatre itself, not history plays themselves. So you have attacks on arts training and education, any account from of history from the National Trust or the BBC that questions things like empire or World War II. And so you have criticism of arts education, the crackdown on rip-off degrees. All of this is kind of arts adjacent, but it's not directly attacking individual plays. And I wondered if that's, to do with that kind of cultural polarization. Has theatre been written off as a fundamentally liberal space? And so that to even sneer at theatre seems like a very metropolitan elite thing to do. So is it possible that this plays like Mary's Seacole and Rockets and Blue Lights don't attract the ire of these culture warriors because they're not encroaching on white spaces in the same way as the BBC and the National Trust are considered to be conventionally, historically, white spaces? Is that one of the factors that's feeding into this, how theatre is perceived?
I mean, the one example I can think of, though it's adjacent to this, but is that moment when the RSC revived a Mary Picks play, and Quentin Letts criticised some colourblind casting, criticised there being a black actor in it, in a historical play. And in a certain way, you could see that as being a bit of policing of how the theatre is allowed to represent history, I suppose, in some ways. But I do suspect you're right, that there's a sort of, in this kind of populist world, the theatre is sort of so irrelevant, or else that's just a liberal elite activity, and it's not even worth drawing attention to.
So focus on the BBC, focus on horrible histories, focus on Netflix and The Crown.
Yeah.
That's where the clicks are to be had.
Well, and was it about 10 days ago in the US, of course, there was a theatre scandal, which was the Congresswoman Lauren Boebert being thrown out of a theatre for vaping and heavy petting, I think they say. What was interesting is she was seeing a touring production of the musical of Beetlejuice. I think it would have been a real scandal for the right if she'd been to see Shakespeare, because that would have been a complete misfit for what her sort of populist right-wing politics might be. So I wonder whether there's something here. There's another question that people have talked a lot about, theatre etiquette. And I wonder if that is that perhaps where the sort of cultural debate about theatre is at the moment? And why do you think that might be?
Yes, I mean, there's some really, some great material on this in Kirsty Sedgman's book on being unreasonable. And one thing that I think makes these kinds of things hard to call is the way that the populist right seems to be an odd mix of libertarianism and authoritarianism. So people shouldn't be cancelled, yay for free speech, but my enemies should be silenced and put in prison. and that makes it very unpredictable and inconsistent to kind of navigate what is considered to be acceptable behaviour at any given point.
You make a very good case, I think, about the potential for the history play to really represent some of the complexities of the broader cultural debate. I suppose I'm still wondering whether the history play can sometimes be a vehicle for conservative and reactionary views. I mean, how far do you think theatre in this country escapes being part of a kind of heritage industry, for example?
Yeah, I think there is still a dominant model of the history play. There's a great piece of writing by Mark Berninger from 20 years ago, which describes the paradigm of the historical realist history play and what you might expect from that in terms of costuming, staging, how people talk and so on. And it is still a dominant way in which history is represented in British theatre. And I wouldn't go so far as to say there is a culture war within theatre about the representation of history, but there is a kind of a difference between the plays I'm talking about in the new book, which push against that, and the ones that are praised and have a long theatrical life and a long afterlife because they closely resemble history on the telly. They kind of resemble what we think history ought to look like, rather than making that skewed and scuffed and slightly ridiculous. So history that takes itself very seriously, I think, is still the dominant thing. And I'm looking at challenges to that, really, in the plays that I'm exploring.
I wonder that I think there's also that interesting thing of a sense of what, not maybe exactly theatre history might be, but a sort of sense of what proper traditional theatre could be, as opposed to radical experiments of various kinds. I was thinking of the, there's a story, Chichester Festival Theatre, sort of famous moment where Chichester Festival Theatre, for those of you who don't know, has a reputation. It's very unfair, it's not quite true, but it has this reputation of being a rather chintzy, suburban, conservative, very old-fashioned theatre. And unfortunately, this story does slightly support that, which is there's a first night, and the lights come up on this sumptuous set of a sort of beautifully well-appointed, aristocratic living room. And as the lights come up, this voice, matronly voice, is heard in the audience going, "Oh, good, a chaise longue." And there's that sort of sense of, oh, this is what theatre's supposed to be.
I know where I am with a chaise longue.
Yeah, exactly. I suppose a different way of thinking about a problem that the theatre has slightly with the history play. It's really interesting thinking about the Romans in Britain. Romans in Britain is a play with a cast of, I can't remember how many characters, 25, 30 characters, something like that. It's got a massive cast. It's the sort of play that even the National Theatre would find very hard to put on now, economically. So the size of theatre casts has gone down, which means that, is there not a slight tension in the history play, which is it risks taking historical processes, which we know are structural and geological and those sorts of things, and turning it into individualized stories about particular people. I mean, in a certain way, the Crown could be criticised for that in a way. It's not really about the structures of equality and wealth and power. It's kind of about who did this with what. Is that how do people fight against that?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, that is what struck me about The Crown, is the way that it presents a kind of false dichotomy. Are you Team Charles or are you Team Diana? Or, curveball, are you Team Anne or Team Prince Philip? And those are the options that you're given, which presents the illusion of the availability of dissident views, but actually they're still presented as the central figures of history. You're not presented with the option of saying, well, just they're awful, get rid of the lot of them. So the way that frames reality very seductively, I think, is very interesting. Thinking about theatre, I think the plays that I'm writing about often have very small casts and can do amazing things with them by not by not treating the idea of staging history with too much reverence. So I'm thinking of a play by Marek Horn called Wild Swimming, which has a cast of 2, and there's a brilliant comment in the director Julia Head's introduction to that play. It takes us through, 400 years of history and characters with elongated lifespans, and all sorts of things happen. She says, we believe that there are always 2 plays being performed. One is the play Wild Swimming by Marek Horn, and the other is 2 actors attempting to perform the play Wild Swimming and ultimately failing. And I think if you open out the activity of the history play to that ridiculousness, that absurdity, that failure, then you have something interesting going on. There's another Jackie Sibley's Drury play that does something comparable. It's a very long title, but it starts, "We are proud to present a presentation about the Herero of Namibia." And it's an attempt by a theatre company to stage a genocide. And they fail utterly, but we learn something about that company and their relationship to history by that failed attempt. So I think those kinds of plays that really focus on that process of trying to stage history are what's really interesting and generative. And I'm probably sort of suspicious of the very large cast play now that seeks to kind of assign individual roles, where you can do much more interesting things with not only multi-rolling, but not hiding the illusion of multi-rolling either.
Well, there's a new season of The Crown before Christmas. Maybe they're going to do it like that. There's a brilliant moment in Mary's Seacole, I think, where one of the nurses reflects on a moment where she inadvertently caught cholera, I think, from a patient. Mary it is, and the line she has is, "My sensations went deranged, and down was up, and the present was the past, and any sense of who I was fell clean away." And of course, it's a brilliant moment because it's a description of what the whole play is like, where the past and the present blur into each other and identity falls clean away. There's a certain traditional kind of, I suppose, leftist critique of certain kinds of history play for making it seem as if, making 2 clear parallels with the present by saying, basically, human nature never changes, everything's cyclical, everything's the same. All of the certainly Romans in Britain and the last 2 plays you talked about, they all blend and find parallels between past and present. How would you say they avoid the risk of making it seem as if history basically doesn't exist, that everything is universal and never changes?
Okay. Well, one thing I realized just reading a book by Anthony P. Panino, who quotes Peter Hall in early discussions about the Romans in Britain with Howard Brenton, he takes the interpretation from the play that nations have to have empires in order to fulfill their potential. So it's a pro-empire play, which I think just goes to show how even when somebody thinks that they're setting out a very precise argument, they can be wildly interpreted. I think the thing that Mary's Seacole and Rockets and Blue Lights do that stops us from just dismissing it as, oh, it's all cycles, it all it will all come round again, is the way that it kind of frames those returning moments, and they invoke an anger. So the last line from Rockets and Blue Lights, Thomas is enslaved. He has a gun pointed at him by an overseer, and he says, "Pull your trigger. I am not afraid of death. I've lived and died 10 million times, and I will live and live again." So the circularity there feels like a call to action. It feels like it's meant to invoke anger rather than a sense of, oh gosh, how neat, how delightfully patterned this treatment of history is. And similarly with Mary's Seacole, there's a moment, I'm not sure how clearly we get this in performance, but in the script, it's that moment where we have all of these white women in the Crimea are crawling towards the women of colour, saying, "Look after me, care for me," and Mary says, "I am strong, but why must I always be the strongest?" And then the comforters build up the strength to comfort again. And it's in that break, in that moment, I think, where it's like, oh, this, really? Again? Okay, here we go. That creates that sense of, no, this doesn't have to always be the same. This, now we know this pattern is here. Let's mark this, and this can shift.
We're getting towards the end of our time, but I want to raise one more issue, which kind of takes us back to the beginning, actually, and the sense that, you know, the truth of history, this highly polarized sense of what is the appropriate thing to say about history, creates a very, very difficult context for the history play, because there is a slight tension, isn't there, between the two words history and play, because, you know, history on some level must have some commitment to truthfully, in some way, representing the way things were, however that's interpreted. And play is about playfulness and fiction and those sorts of things. I was thinking about the television docudrama, The Deal, which was Peter Morgan, is it? Which was about the Tony Blair, Gordon Brown deal that they made. After John Smith died, the Labour leader died in 1994, they famously both wanted to go for the Labour leadership. They had a dinner at Granita, a restaurant in Islington, don't look for it, it's not there anymore, and at that dinner, they agreed that Tony Blair would go for it, and at some point would step down in favour of Gordon Brown. And exactly what the nature of that deal was caused 20 years of wrangling between them. In the television version, Tony Blair bounces in. It's Michael Sheen playing, I think, for the first time, Tony Blair, and he's all sort of, oh, lovely, and he orders himself a meal and sits there eating it. And Gordon Brown sits there with a glass of water. Now, apparently, they both actually had a meal. And there were some people who were very critical of this and saying that this was twisting the facts of history. Okay. But there's a bit of me that wants to defend lying about history to tell a different sort of truth in a play, because it seems to me it's a much better representation of the rather dour and austere Gordon Brown to have him sitting there with a glass of water and puppyish Tony Blair sitting there wolfing down his whatever it is. In the kind of polarised world we're in, how is it possible for history plays to both be historical and playful? Tiny little question to end with.
Yes. I think I can wrap this one up in 30 seconds. I mean, that's at the heart of it. And are the primary loyalties towards the historical record or towards what's good for the play, what makes it work as a play? And I think this tension is highly productive, but I do agree that there is a kind of bias towards literalism that is often at the root of the objections towards staging history. Thinking about Mary Whitehouse's objection to the Romans in Britain, it was that this was literally a sex act taking place on stage, and therefore we were literally in a sex club watching something obscene, rather than that it was a representation of something which was also a metaphor for something else. So, you know, people talk about kind of weaponized incompetence, that if you're kind of deliberately bad at something, then somebody else will come in and you hope do it for you, and you'll never be asked again. There's a kind of weaponized literalism that's being invoked here, which is like, I refuse to see why do we have more than one Mary Seacole? What is that about? Why? I think it's trying to tell us something, but I really, no, I don't think so. The refusal to engage with anything on the level of metaphor and to actually kind of use that to score political points.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you, Dan, for teasing out so many of the aspects of this fascinating topic that we've both been engaged with over the years. And there's just time before we finish to say some thanks and acknowledgements to a very important part of an inaugural lecture, to really note how I've been helped and supported to this point by friends, family, colleagues. So I can't hope to be comprehensive in this, but I'd like to start by thanking Rebecca for introducing me so generously this evening, and also for being such an excellent collaborator in both the learning and teaching sides of things and the research and the way that those things intersect as well. And also for sharing the development and writing of our 2 books, which are both due out next year. Rebecca's is called Feminism and Dramaturgy and the Contemporary History Play, so look out for that. I want to say thanks to Dan Rebellato, not only for coming here to celebrate with me here this evening, but also for agreeing to make this into a dialogue, for giving me the best possible starts in academic life, from my first conference, which we attended together in Leeds back in 2006, to my thesis, my first publications, and, as Rebecca mentioned, the Resisting Theatre Conference in 2021. I owe you a great deal, Dan, for building my confidence as a writer and challenging me as a thinker. Thank you. My thanks also go to Emma Bonham, to the organising team behind this event, to the technical staff, to Craig up there, and to everyone who's made this possible. And thanks to everyone who's joining us on the live stream. Really appreciate your presence, your support, feeling your warmth here. I want to thank the anonymous external referees who recommended me for a professorship, and also the trusted colleagues who've been so supportive in giving feedback on my latest book project. They are Chris Megson, David Barnett, Rebecca Benzie, Bridget Foreman, Liz Tomlin, and members of the Cultural Histories and Legacies Research Cluster here at the University of York, who gave early feedback on the introductory chapter. I want to thank David Barnett, my research mentor, for his stalwart support and sound advice, always. I'm grateful to Professor Jan Hardman from the Department of Education here at York, who's been so generous with her time and her insights, and who's made collaboration across departments and faculties not just possible, but really enjoyable. Thank you, Jan. I want to thank Selma Dimitrovic, whose perspectives on theatre and dramaturgy have been an absolute game changer for me and for Rebecca. She's a cherished collaborator whose ideas and sayings continue to live rent-free in my head. Thank you, Selma. Thank you to Poppy, Poppy Corbett, a brilliant playwright and collaborator as well. And if you're watching, hi, Poppy. It's great to see you. I want to thank my family, some of whom are, I think, watching tonight. Hello, Mum. Hello, Dad. Hello, Pam. Hello, Mike. Thanks to my oldest friends and colleagues, especially Sheila Wolfe, Mike Carter, Ben Masters, all of whom have spurred me on in so many ways, big and small, to be the person and the scholar that I am today. Very special thanks to Varsha for all her encouragement, support and inspiration. And to my children, Lydia and Harry, for their joy, for their energy, for their love. With kids around, you're never far from a question about history, and you're never far from a drama either. If you can, please join us for the drinks reception just outside. Thanks again for coming, and please have a very good evening.